Tellico, Ellis County, Texas, the 29th of July.
In the spring of 2006, 19-year-old college student Jessica O'Grady went missing late one evening in Omaha, Nebraska. Jessica had been on her way to see her boyfriend and stay the night. But according to him, she never arrived. Days would pass as panic spread from her friends and family to the broader community. It became increasingly clear that Jessica had met with foul play. Law enforcement were convinced that they had narrowed in on the killer, but unable to find Jessica and lacking any details of what exactly happened to her, their case was too weak to make an arrest. Or was it? After graduating high school in Omaha, Nebraska, 19-year-old Jessica O'Grady stayed close to home. She moved into an apartment with two friends and began waitressing at a local Lone Star restaurant, while enrolling in courses at the University of Nebraska. Jessica was a sophomore majoring in social studies and aspired to become a teacher. After taking a second part-time job at a daycare, Jessica had realized how passionate she was for childhood education. She even volunteered to coach her niece's softball team. In the spring of 2006, Jessica was taking a semester off of her studies, preferring to work and earn some extra cash. She was also taking some time to enjoy her social life. After a year-and-a-half-long high school relationship had ended, Jessica was free to pursue other relationships, and to fall for a new man. Christopher Edwards worked alongside Jessica as a bartender at the Lone Star in Omaha. Christopher had also attended the University of Nebraska, but he had dropped out of college in favor of making more money at work. Chris worked a lot of hours at the restaurant. He was aiming for a promotion into management. In the meantime, he lived with his Aunt Jane, where a separate entrance and the basement all to himself afforded him a bit of independence. Christopher could come and go as he pleased, and he had some privacy. Christopher took full advantage of this arrangement. He and Jessica, hitting it off at work, began seeing each other. It had only been a few months, but in early May 2006, Jessica delivered to Christopher the happy news. She was pregnant. On Friday, the 12th of May 2006, Jessica did not turn up for her scheduled shift at the Lone Star. By this time, friends and family members had been trying and failing to connect with Jessica since Thursday morning. Slowly, it began to emerge that no one in Jessica's life had seen or heard from her throughout that time. Odd behavior from a friend, niece, and daughter that kept in regular, nearly daily contact. Jessica's family notified the police. Her aunt, Shauna Stanzel, with whom Jessica was very close, had last seen her niece after a softball game on Wednesday evening, the 10th of May. But Jessica failed to show at the next game, scheduled on the following Sunday. Shauna had been trying to speak to as many of Jessica's friends as possible to locate her, and she was coming up empty. Even more frightening was the fact that Jessica had not picked up her latest paycheck. Her personal effects remained in her room in the shared apartment, and her cat Zoe, who she called her baby, had also been seemingly abandoned. Things were not adding up. Although Jessica's phone, purse, and car were all missing, there was no way the cheerful, expectant mother had left voluntarily. Nearly a week after Jessica was last seen, her small hatchback, a Hyundai Accent, was found by a local businessman in a parking lot across the street from the restaurant where she worked. The keys were missing. The car was dusted for fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, but nothing was found. There was also no indication that Jessica had driven the vehicle there, nor any cameras in the area that could have captured the vehicle or its driver. The recovery of the car heightened the stakes of the investigation, which was now a formal criminal probe. Law enforcement gained access to Jessica's phone logs and began to track her last known movements. A handful of friends had gathered at Jessica's apartment on the evening of Wednesday, the 10th of May, the last day that anyone saw Jessica. The group chatted and ate some pizza. According to friends, Jessica was texting throughout the evening. She had also been talking, about Christopher Edwards. Jessica was optimistic about her relationship and her pregnancy. She had started on prenatal vitamins. She was excited to become a mother. After Jessica received a telephone call later that night, she took a shower, fixed her hair, put on makeup, and left the apartment. This was at about 11 or 11:15 p.m. Her destination? The home of Christopher Edwards. It was a roughly 8-mile drive out to the suburb where Christopher lived. Jessica's last phone activity showed a call to her friend Carrie at about 11:30 p.m., followed by a phone call to Christopher roughly 20 minutes later. On the 11:30 call, Jessica informed her friend that she was en route to Christopher's. The last text message Jessica sent was also to Carrie at 12:20 a.m. It read, "No shenanigans for Jessica." According to Carrie, this was a code the girls used for when hooking up with boys. She understood this message to mean this was not happening for Jessica that night. But she did not reply, and her calls the next morning went unanswered. Every call to Jessica after that time was forwarded direct to her voicemail. Her last banking transactions occurred earlier that day. It was the last time anyone had heard from Jessica O'Grady. Extensive searches undertaken by law enforcement and supported by masses of volunteers beginning in the days following her disappearance turned up no signs of Jessica.
His family is still wondering where she is.
You just have to try to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
The tree-covered and rocky terrain of the surrounding area presented a challenge for search parties, as well as ample opportunities for a killer to potentially dispose of a body. More than 150 acres surrounding Cunningham Lake were covered by the search efforts. The mud bars and sandy shorelines along the Elkhorn River were scanned, and volunteers divided into organized search parties navigated large rocks and slippery slopes. While these efforts were underway, Christopher Edwards was spending the weekend with his girlfriend. Not Jessica O'Grady, of course, but his longtime girlfriend, a woman named Michelle Wilkin. Michelle met Christopher while they were working at the same restaurant in March 2005. They became friends, then developed a romantic relationship. By January 2006, Michelle had become pregnant. The relationship was ostensibly exclusive. According to Michelle, on the evening of May 8th, only 2 days before Jessica went missing, Michelle and Christopher had discussed plans to be married. At not quite 20 years old, working as a bartender and living in his aunt's basement, Christopher Edwards was about to become the father of 2 children from 2 different women. Michelle, whom he planned to marry, was completely unaware of his relationship with Jessica O'Grady. She certainly was not aware that Jessica was also expecting his baby. She spent the days following Jessica's disappearance with Christopher in his basement bedroom, oblivious to the extensive searches taking place from that house in a mile radius outwards for Jessica. When Shauna Stansel began looking for her niece, she stopped by the Lone Star restaurant and spoke to several employees, including Christopher Edwards. Christopher told her that he had no idea where Jessica was. In fact, he had not seen her since Tuesday the 9th. He said the two had plans for the Wednesday night, but those had fallen through. He did not see Jessica that night after all. This was the same version of events Christopher then told the police when they arrived at his home and requested, with his permission, to have a look around. On this initial visit, officers did not have a warrant, so any areas that Christopher did not wish to be searched would be avoided, they said. Although he preferred for them to come back in a few days, Christopher eventually consented to a controlled search. Controlled by him, of course. Officers began scanning around his room. But as they approached his bed, Christopher spoke up. There was no need for them to look at the mattress, he said. The detective on scene proposed the theory that Jessica had committed suicide. Since the couple had been together only days earlier, perhaps she chose to hide a note under the mattress of his bed. According to police reports, Christopher replied that this logic made sense to him, and so the search continued. Christopher explained that a small stain of blood on top of the mattress was menstrual blood, but when police lifted the mattress, they found a stain covering most of the bottom side of the mattress. A formal search warrant was obtained for the house, and a full forensic processing of the area was undertaken. Over the next 10 hours, the house was inspected thoroughly by the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, though the investigation had been initially launched by the Omaha PD. The inspection was overseen by Chief Crime Scene Investigator David Kofod, who led the CSI unit for Douglas County. Kofod had a reputation as a star CSI supervisor, having recently cleverly discovered key evidence in high-profile murder cases in adjoining counties. Christopher Edwards himself was processed. They took hairs, fingerprints, nail clippings, and DNA swabs. Nearly 200 photos were taken inside the house that night, detailing the basement bedroom, the walls, the ceiling, and other areas, including the garage. In the bedroom, blood spatter, some of which was visible to the naked eye, was documented throughout the area surrounding the bed. Christopher explained that he had cut his wrist a few days earlier. That injury accounted for these stains, he said. Luminol was applied to the walls of the room. Stains were found on the ceiling. These stains and those on the walls had been haphazardly and ineffectively covered up by white paint. The blood found throughout the room was a DNA match to Jessica O'Grady. Pillows and sheets from the bed had been removed and replaced. The mattress had been flipped. Scented candles had been lit throughout. A sweet scent was left lingering in the air. It was not a thorough cleanup job, but it was undeniably an attempt to conceal what had happened to Jessica O'Grady in that room. A black plastic trash bag was found in the garage next to Christopher's car. The bag contained 2 blood-stained towels and a receipt from a drugstore in West Omaha. Investigators sourced surveillance footage from that shop and captured Christopher at the drugstore just past 7:30 p.m. on Thursday, May 11th. There he purchased poster paint, white shoe polish, and correction fluid. The poster paint was chemically identical to that found on his bedroom ceiling. Christopher Edwards voluntarily turned himself into the police, but he was not formally charged. There were gaps in the case against him. Jessica had not been found, nor had any potential murder weapon. By the time that the mattress was discovered in Christopher's room, there had been nearly a week lead time for the disposal of evidence. The amount of blood found in the house indicated that Jessica had not left the property alive. This raised questions as to how Christopher could have moved her from the house. There were only 2 ways out of the basement. The storm window was too narrow to lift her through, so this left the staircase.
The 135-pound kid did not carry her out of there alone. There was no drippings, no drag marks, and so he had help.
Somebody who knows where Jessica O'Grady's body is, and knowing that there's a human being out there who would not have the empathy to come forward and tell the sheriff's department where she's at is probably the most difficult part to deal with, other than the loss that we deal with every day.
Douglas County Sheriff's Department knew they had their man, but they did not have a clear theory of the crime to present for an indictment. The state of Nebraska had never obtained a murder conviction without locating the body of the victim. The CSI team under the leadership of David Kofod returned to the house once more. Miraculously and fortunately for the investigation, upon this re-examination, Kofod discovered 2 small blots of dried blood in the upper trunk frame of Christopher's car. One small stain was taken from the upper gas casket, exactly where it could not be visible from any angle unless one was directly inside the trunk. The second was on the underside of the trunk lid. 2 previous CSI team members had searched the vehicle and missed it. Even more crucially, Kofod discovered in the closet of Christopher's bedroom a pair of Bangkok ceremonial swords, referred to in the media as samurai swords. Somehow, these swords had been overlooked during the original search, but now they were pegged as the likely murder weapon. Several other small knives were also obtained for testing from this second search. Lab tests were conducted at the University of Nebraska and returned a series of results that would prove to be the turning point in the investigation. First, the small dried samples taken from the trunk of Christopher's car returned a positive match to Jessica O'Grady. A small stain, potentially blood, was swabbed from the handle of one of the ceremonial swords. This also matched to Jessica. Testing on the tip of this sword identified Jessica's DNA. Pruning shears retrieved during the first search were then retested at the instruction of David Kofod. He had a feeling about them. They had originally tested negative for any DNA, but this time they also returned a match to Jessica. DNA was found on the handle, but no blood was on them at all. Investigators determined that the sword must have been the murder weapon. From the DNA and blood spatter evidence, detectives deduced that Jessica was attacked while she slept on Christopher's bed on the night of May 10th. Christopher subsequently carried her up the stairs and into the garage, then into his vehicle and disposed of her body in an unknown location. He later drove her vehicle to the parking lot near to the restaurant and abandoned it. How the pruning shears factored into the theory of the murder remained entirely unclear. Furthermore, there were no signs of cleaning products having been used in the trunk of the car, yet somehow it was spotless with the exception of the hidden samples identified by Kofod. The sword, the assumed murder weapon, was likewise remarkably clean. Christopher Edwards was charged with the murder of Jessica O'Grady. At that time, a plea deal was offered to him in exchange for revealing where he left Jessica. This deal would have seen the 19-year-old sentenced to 10 to 20 years and eligible for parole as quickly as 5 years into serving his term. Christopher could easily have been released before his 30th birthday, but he rejected the offer. His father, Bob Edwards, was reportedly so convinced that a jury could not convict his son of murder without a body that he compelled his son to reject any offer made to serve less time.
It feels like, although she is not alive, that her remains are held hostage, and that doesn't seem fair to us.
The trial commenced in late March 2007. Michelle Wilkin, now mother to their baby daughter, took the stand in Christopher's defense. She testified that she had no idea about the state of the mattress when she stayed with Christopher in the days following Jessica's disappearance. She had been, at the time, completely unaware of any relationship between Jessica and Christopher. Christopher's Aunt Jane and his teenage cousin both testified that they were at home on the night of May 10th and heard no noise emanating from the basement in the night. But the blood evidence on the mattress, ceiling, and walls was damning. Christopher's defense attorney, Stephen Leffler, somewhat absurdly maintained Christopher's original explanations for the bloodstains, assertions that were thought to be received as insulting to the jury. What Leffler failed to argue were the inconsistencies in the state's version of events. How was it possible that the ceremonial sword was the murder weapon, yet contained only a tiny fragment of blood on the handle? Surely there would have been more left behind, particularly given the ornate design of the sword. Why would Christopher have left it in the bedroom closet for weeks instead of disposing of it alongside the other evidence, or even after the police suspected him of murder? Assuming the theory was accurate, Christopher also disposed of Jessica's phone, wallet, clothing, as well as his clothing, and all of the original bedding. Why do this while leaving the murder weapon in his closet? And if all he did was flip the mattress and apply light layers of correction fluid to his walls, how did he leave only 2 fragments of blood in the trunk of his car? The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree, as well as use of a deadly weapon. It was the first no-body murder trial in the state's history to end in a guilty verdict.
Thankful for the men and women who were able to sit on the jury and deliver a verdict that objectively stated what we've believed all along.
Christopher Edwards was sentenced to a term of 80 years to life imprisonment for second-degree murder, and a term of 20 years imprisonment on the deadly weapon conviction. sentences to be served consecutively.
I said the fine work from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and their CSI people, and the work that they did at that scene and preserving that for the jury. They did a tremendous job, and we felt very comfortable, and there was never any doubt in our minds about that evidence.
The search for Jessica continued for years following the conviction. Thousands of hours had gone into the effort. There were 46 different missions. Not-for-profit groups became involved, and a full 5-mile radius of his aunt's home had been scoured. A hole was discovered in the area of Cunningham Lake. It was speculated that Christopher had begun to dig this hole, perhaps with the single shovel found with Christopher's car and the shears, but was unable to create a substantial hole, so it was abandoned. This theory holds that after this attempt, he left Jessica in the water. Christopher was not providing any information. His father's home was searched extensively.
Investigators worked around the home of O'Grady's killer's father, Robert Edwards, there in the early afternoon, but left shortly after our cameras arrived. Deputies and forensic experts taping off the back, carrying buckets and shovels, focusing efforts behind dark curtains.
What did the cadaver dog alert you to?
That there could be a body. But right now, it's anything that we do find, we'll bag and tag it and take a look at it further with microscopes back at the lab.
A new back deck that had been constructed in the weeks following Jessica's disappearance was dug up, then reconstructed when law enforcement discovered absolutely nothing.
Nothing. Absolutely. We found rock, is what we found, rock and concrete in a mass, and it was in the exact location and depth that we saw on the charts. We'll lick our wounds, we'll continue our investigation, and go on from there.
Bob Edwards had also come under scrutiny earlier on. It seems likely that Christopher had not covered up the crime independently. He must have had assistance lifting Jessica and disposing of her car, if nothing else. But there was never a DNA match made to his father, Robert, nor any other substantial link made to an accomplice. When Christopher appeared in court to appeal his conviction, he was a changed man. Longer hair and crude tattoos showed the many years he had already spent in prison. His first appeal in 2011 coincided with another related development. In that same year, another Douglas County resident was serving time in prison. David Kofod. The CSI supervisor and star of the Douglas County investigative team had been convicted of manufacturing evidence. Prior to his conviction, he had become famous in Nebraska for being able to find evidence when no one else could. Then, in 2 separate murder cases in neighboring Cass County, earlier in the same year that Jessica went missing, Kofod's miraculous discoveries came into question. He was found to have planted blood samples in key locations at crime scenes and in areas where law enforcement hoped to discover damning evidence. In one of these cases, detectives lacked any physical evidence against their key suspects. This was the case of Wayne and Charbon Stock, who were found viciously murdered in their Nebraska farmhouse, apparently killed on Easter Sunday, 2006. In a process that seemed to mirror that of Jessica's case, the suspect's car was searched thoroughly by other forensic experts, finding nothing of value. Then, just as the momentum of the case slowed to a halt, Kofod decided to re-examine a specific hidden area of the console of the suspect's car. There, he found the DNA of the victim, linking the suspects to the crime. Kofod's placement of blood samples was discovered when additional evidence, including a confession, proved definitively that these suspects were innocent of the murders. A generous assessment of the blood found in Christopher's car suggests it was a small transfer stain. More likely, it was the result of a diluted blood sample blotted onto the interior of the trunk by David Kofod. If Jessica had been placed in that location after she was attacked, investigators would have expected the removal of the interior rug to reveal far more staining.
Someone else had examined the car besides Kofod?
Somebody had examined the car the day before Kofod. 2 Douglas County sheriffs did it just like they had in the Murdoch case.
They didn't find anything?
Didn't find anything.
Likewise, the small sample on the sword appears to have been falsely sourced. The spatter in the room indicated that a much smaller weapon was used. It was speculated at the time that without the forensic evidence retrieved by David Kofod in the second search of the house, the state may have delayed or outright refused to bring charges against Christopher Edwards. In fact, this was the stalled state of the case against Christopher until Kofod re-examined the scene. The Court of Appeals, however, determined that regardless of Christopher's claims of false evidence, there was enough to prove his guilt.
Prove that the evidence was fabricated, that it was a violation of substantive due process.
Which part of the evidence? Not the mattress.
Not the mattress.
If you take this evidence out as if it had never been presented to a jury, would he still have been convicted? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Christopher Edwards' first appeal in 2012 and later plea for a new trial in 2016 were denied. His secondary motion in 2018 also failed. Had he taken the plea deal, he would have likely already been released. David Kofod, after serving roughly 18 months in prison on a potential 4-year sentence, maintains that he did not plant any evidence in the Jessica O'Grady case, or in any other.
That judge thinks they did not prove I planted evidence. There's no way. There was no way you could prove that. I've been to the parole board twice and told them, I don't have anything to be remorseful about. I can jam this time and I will.
There has been no real closure for Shauna Stansel or the rest of Jessica's family and her many close friends. Jessica has not been found.
You don't forget the day that, someone that you loved and that you were so close to goes missing. I think people close to him know. I think that any one of those people could come forward and, let us know where she's at so that we could give her a proper burial.
Christopher Edwards maintains his innocence. He continues to serve out his 100-year sentence. His family claims there were leads in the case that were ignored by investigators who narrowed in on Christopher early on and then failed to look elsewhere. They have stated, both families deserve closure with justice. The single-sided efforts displayed so far by law enforcement will achieve neither. We also hope they consider now as a good time to swallow some pride and ego for the benefit of everyone.